Man dies and meets grandfather in heaven. His revelation will shock you, NDE. The cold touch of the hospital room lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling within. Machines beeped in a discordant rhythm, punctuating the shallow breaths of a man on the brink. John Sullivan, 42, an otherwise unremarkable accountant, lay pale and motionless as nurses and doctors scrambled around him, their voices taut with urgency. "Clear," barked the lead physician, his voice cutting through the tension as paddles were pressed against John's chest. His body convulsed, but the flat line persisted. In the corner of the room, unnoticed by the medical staff, John was standing, or rather, he thought he was. The strangest part was that his body was still lying on the hospital bed, lifeless, with tubes and wires protruding like the roots of a dying tree. He blinked, staring at himself, uncomprehending. What's happening?" he murmured, though his voice seemed to fall into a void, unheard even by himself. The sensation was surreal. The frantic attempts to save him felt distant, like a memory blurred by time. Slowly, he became aware of a different reality unfolding around him. A soft, golden glow crept into the room, dissolving the harsh fluorescent lighting and the mechanical noise. The glow was warm, inviting, and somehow familiar. John turned his gaze toward the light, his confusion momentarily replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. It wasn't just a glow, it was a presence, vast and incomprehensible. It tugged at him, like a gentle current urging him toward a destination he couldn't see. With a deep, instinctive trust, he stepped forward, leaving the frenzied scene of his resuscitation behind. He found himself walking, though the floor beneath him was neither cold nor solid. It felt like walking on a cloud, yet his steps carried purpose. The glow expanded into a horizon of shimmering light, and John realized he was no longer alone. Shadows, no figures, formed within the brilliance, indistinct yet pulsating with life. They were not strangers, but they were not fully familiar either. He could feel them more than he could see them, like faint echoes of loved ones from long ago. Suddenly, a figure emerged with clarity, stepping forward from the others. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded a warmth that seemed to wrap around John like a protective embrace. His face was etched with the weathered kindness of someone who had seen both the harshness and beauty of life. "Grandpa?" John whispered, his voice trembling. The man smiled, a smile that carried years of wisdom and a lifetime of unspoken words. "John," the man said, his voice steady and rich, like a melody John hadn't realized he missed. "But I don't understand," John stammered. "Am I dead?" His grandfather's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "Not quite. You're in between, John. Caught in the space where the soul seeks clarity." The words should have frightened him, but instead, they filled him with a strange, calming certainty. Questions bubbled to the surface of John's mind, but none of them seemed important enough to voice. Instead, he found himself saying, "I missed you." "And I've been here," his grandfather replied, his voice tinged with emotion. "Watching, guiding when I could, waiting for this moment." John stepped closer, feeling the ache of years spent missing this man, a man who had been a pillar in his childhood but was lost to him far too soon. "Is this heaven?" he asked, glancing around at the endless expanse of light and warmth. "It's a glimpse," his grandfather said, gesturing around. "A reflection of what lies beyond. But it's not just for marveling, John. You've come here for a reason." John frowned. "A reason? What do you mean?" "I didn't choose this. I don't even know how I got here." "You did choose, in a way," his grandfather said gently. "Your soul is tethered to a lesson, a truth that you must understand before you can truly return." "Return?" The word startled John. "You mean I can go back?" "That's up to you," his grandfather said, his tone growing serious. "But first, you must confront what brought you here. The choices, the pain, the love you've forgotten." John's chest tightened, though he had no body to feel it with. His grandfather's words were a mirror reflecting all the cracks and flaws he had tried to ignore. "I don't understand," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "You will," his grandfather said, his gaze steady. "But you must be willing to look deeper, John. To face yourself." The glow around them began to shift, the warmth taking on a sharper edge. Images flickered in the air like fragments of a dream. John saw himself as a boy, clutching his mother's hand, his eyes wide with wonder and fear as they stood at his grandfather's funeral. He saw the nights spent working late, missing his son's soccer games, and the strained silences with his wife at the dinner table. Each scene was a jolt, a reminder of the life he had lived and the moments he had lost. Tears welled in John's eyes as he turned back to his grandfather. "I've made so many mistakes," he choked out. "How do I fix it? How do I make it right?" His grandfather stepped closer, placing a firm hand on John's shoulder. "The answer isn't in fixing the past, John. It's in understanding it. Only then can you move forward." The glow began to dim slightly, and for the first time, John felt a tug, a pull back toward the hospital room he had left behind. The beeping of machines and frantic voices crept into the edges of his consciousness. "No," he said, his voice rising. "I'm not ready to go back. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do." His grandfather's eyes softened, and he leaned in, whispering words that reverberated through John like a bell. "The truth will come, John. Trust the journey." Before John could respond, the light shifted again, and he found himself teetering on the edge of the ethereal and the physical, the weight of his grandfather's words heavy in his soul. John felt a jarring sensation as the warm glow dimmed further, pulling him away from his grandfather's reassuring presence. The tugging force grew stronger, like invisible hands pulling him backward, back toward the sterile chaos of the hospital. He resisted instinctively, planting his feet against the ethereal ground, though it provided no traction. "Wait," he called out, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the void. The serene glow that had surrounded him moments ago was replaced by a stark emptiness, cold and unyielding. Shadows loomed, but not in a menacing way. These shadows felt heavy, burdened with meaning. Suddenly, the space around him transformed. He wasn't in the hospital anymore, nor in the comforting presence of his grandfather. Instead, he found himself in a dimly lit room, faintly familiar but tinged with a haunting sense of regret. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of memories not yet acknowledged. The first sound he noticed was the faint murmur of laughter, followed by the clinking of glasses. He turned and found himself staring at a younger version of himself. It was a party, his engagement party, to be precise. The memory was unmistakable, even though it had been years since he thought about that night. John saw himself standing in the corner of the room, holding a drink and laughing with friends. His fiancée, Sarah, glowed with happiness, her arm wrapped tightly around his. John moved closer, compelled by the scene playing out in front of him. He remembered this night. It had been one of the happiest moments of his life, or so he had convinced himself at the time. Yet as he observed the memory, subtle cracks began to appear in the image of perfection. His fiancée's smile faltered when John turned to joke with one of his friends, leaving her standing awkwardly by herself. The young John in the memory didn't notice. He was too engrossed in his own world, basking in the attention of his friends. The scene shifted slightly, fast-forwarding to later in the evening. Sarah was sitting alone at a table, her expression distant and her shoulders slumped. "Why didn't I see this?" John whispered, his chest tightening as he watched the scene unfold. He wanted to step forward, to say something, to comfort her, but he couldn't move. He was only an observer, trapped in the memories he had chosen to ignore for so long. The laughter and chatter of the party faded, and the room dissolved into darkness. When the light returned, John was in a different memory. This time, he was sitting in his office, late at night. Papers were strewn across his desk, and the faint hum of a fluorescent light buzzed overhead. He was on the phone, his tone clipped and impatient. "I told you, I'll be home late," the memory version of John said. "Just go to bed without me." The voice on the other end of the line was Sarah's, weary and resigned. "It's Jake's recital, John," she said quietly. "You promised you'd be there." "I know, but I've got deadlines," he snapped, rubbing his temples. "I'll make it up to him, okay?" The line went silent for a moment before Sarah replied, her voice tinged with disappointment. "He doesn't want you to make it up, John. He just wants you there." The call ended, and the memory John leaned back in his chair, sighing heavily. The younger version of himself seemed burdened, but not enough to change his priorities. The real John, standing as a silent observer, clenched his fists. "I thought I was doing what was best," he said aloud, though no one could hear him. "I thought I was providing for them." A voice broke through the memory, soft yet firm. "And in doing so, you lost what mattered most." John spun around to see his grandfather again, standing in the shadows of the memory. His face was solemn, his eyes filled with a mix of compassion and sadness. "I didn't know," John said defensively, though his voice cracked with emotion. "I thought I had time. I thought they understood." His grandfather stepped forward, the room dissolving into the void once more. "Time is a precious thing, John," he said, "but it's often spent as if it's endless. You traded moments for success, thinking you could reclaim them later." The words stung because they rang true. John lowered his gaze, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. "I wanted to give them everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize I was taking everything away instead." His grandfather placed a hand on his shoulder, the warmth of the gesture cutting through the cold emptiness. "It's not too late to understand, John," he said. "But understanding requires facing the pain you've buried." Before John could respond, the void shifted again, and he found himself in yet another memory. This time, he was standing in his son Jake's bedroom. Jake was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a soccer ball in his hands. He looked up at his father, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "Are you coming to my game tomorrow, Dad?" Jake asked, his voice small. The memory John hesitated, glancing at his phone as it buzzed with a new email notification. "I'll try, buddy," he said, forcing a smile. "I've got a lot of work, but I'll do my best." Jake's shoulders slumped, and he nodded. "It's okay," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I know you're busy." The real John felt his heart break as he watched the scene play out. He remembered this moment vividly, but at the time, he hadn't realized the impact of his words. He had told himself that Jake would understand, that there would always be another game, another chance to make it right. "I'm sorry," John whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean to let you down." The memory dissolved, and John was left alone in the void once more. His grandfather's voice echoed around him, though the man was nowhere to be seen. "Understanding begins with acknowledgement," the voice said. But acknowledgement alone is not enough. John felt the pull again, stronger this time. He knew he was being drawn closer to the hospital, to the life he had left behind. But the memories clung to him, their weight impossible to ignore. John found himself drifting again, the memories receding like a tide pulling away from the shore. The void around him was cold and silent, yet the air was thick with expectation, as though he was standing on the precipice of something monumental. His breathing, or whatever the ethereal equivalent of breathing was, grew shallow, and his chest tightened. The pull toward his body was growing stronger, but it wasn't taking him back yet. Something else awaited him here, something he could feel pressing against his soul. Suddenly, the darkness was pierced by a faint, flickering light. It wasn't the warm, golden glow of his earlier encounter with his grandfather. This light was different, smaller, more subdued, and flickering like the flame of a dying candle. As John moved closer, the light illuminated a scene in front of him. It was his living room, but not the way he remembered it. It was emptier, colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the space. Sitting on the couch was Sarah. She looked older, her face etched with lines of weariness and sadness. Beside her was Jake, now a teenager. He was taller, his features sharper, but his eyes carried the same vulnerable hope that had always been there. In his hands was a framed photo of John, the glass cracked down the middle. "I don't even remember what his voice sounds like," Jake said softly, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. Sarah closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. "He loved you, Jake. Don't ever doubt that." Jake's grip on the photo tightened, his knuckles whitening. "If he loved me, why wasn't he ever here? Why did he always choose work over us?" The pain in his voice was palpable, and John felt it like a physical blow. He wanted to scream, to tell Jake that it wasn't true, that he had loved him more than anything. But no sound came out. He could only watch, helpless, as the scene unfolded. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking. "I wish I had an answer for you. But love isn't always enough to make someone see what's right in front of them." Jake stood abruptly, the photo slipping from his hands and falling to the floor with a dull thud. He didn't bother to pick it up as he stormed out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with her grief. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. John stepped closer, his heart aching as he reached out instinctively toward Sarah. His hand passed through her, the gesture futile. "I didn't mean for this," he whispered, though the words dissolved into the void. "I thought I was doing what was best. I thought they would understand." The living room faded, and John was plunged back into the void. His grandfather's voice returned, calm yet unyielding. "They needed you, John. Not the version of you that worked late and promised next time. They needed the man who laughed with them, who showed up for them." "I thought I was showing up," John argued, his voice tinged with desperation. "I worked hard to give them everything they needed. Did they need a bigger house? A newer car?" his grandfather asked pointedly. "Or did they need you at the dinner table? At Jake's games?" Holding Sarah's hand when she felt alone. The words stung, cutting through the layers of justification John had built around himself. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down he knew his grandfather was right. He had traded moments for material comforts, believing it was what a good husband and father should do. "I can't change it," John said, his voice cracking. "I can't undo what's already been done." "No, you can't," his grandfather replied, stepping into the void beside him. His expression was gentle but firm. "But you can choose to see it, to learn from it. That's why you're here." The void shifted again, this time transforming into a hospital room, not the one John had just left, but a memory from years ago. Sarah was in a hospital bed, her face pale and drawn. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling the room. John stood by her side, his phone in one hand and a folder of work papers in the other. "I'll only be gone for an hour," the memory John said, his tone hurried. "I've got a meeting I can't miss." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, her gaze heavy with exhaustion and disappointment. "John," she said weakly, her voice barely audible. "Please. I'll be back before you know it," the younger John said, leaning down to kiss her forehead before rushing out the door. The real John clenched his fists as he watched the scene. He remembered this day vividly. Sarah had been in the hospital for complications during her pregnancy with Jake. He had promised to stay with her, but when work called, he had convinced himself that stepping away was justified. "She begged me to stay," John murmured, his voice thick with guilt. "And I left her. I thought I'd have time to make it up to her later." His grandfather's voice was quiet but firm. "How many times have you told yourself that, John? That there would be time later?" John didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of his choices, his failures, was too heavy to bear. The hospital room dissolved, leaving him alone in the void once more. He sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the pain of what he had seen. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I thought I was being a good provider." "Being a provider is not just about money," his grandfather said, his tone softening. "It's about being present, about giving your time, your love, your attention. That's what they needed from you, John." John looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "How do I fix this? How do I make it right?" "That's not for me to decide," his grandfather replied. "But you must first understand what brought you here. Only then can you choose your path forward." The pull toward his body grew stronger, the sensation more insistent. The hospital room was waiting for him, the life he had left behind calling him back. But John wasn't ready to return, not yet. There was still more he needed to see, more he needed to understand. The void around him shifted once more, and he braced himself for whatever was coming next. John stood frozen as the void around him began to ripple and shift again. This time, it wasn't a memory from his past but something stranger, something that didn't feel entirely real. The darkness cracked open, revealing a small, quiet park. It was night, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. A single bench sat under a flickering street lamp, and on that bench sat a boy. John approached cautiously, his steps tentative. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, his small frame hunched over, clutching a soccer ball. His face was familiar, too familiar, though it took John a moment to place him. "Jake?" he whispered, his breath catching in his throat. The boy looked up, his face younger and unburdened by the years that had weighed down the Jake John had just seen in the fragmented memories. This was his son as a child, before the disappointment and hurt had taken root. "Hi, Dad," the boy said, his voice soft but clear. John's heart clenched. "Jake, what are you doing here? How can you be here?" The boy didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked down at the soccer ball in his hands, turning it slowly. "Do you remember when you got me this ball?" he asked. John nodded, his throat tightening. He did remember. It had been a rushed gift, something he had picked up on the way home from work after missing yet another one of Jake's games. At the time, he had thought it would make up for his absence. "I thought it was the coolest thing ever," Jake continued, his voice tinged with a bittersweet tone. "I took it everywhere. I even slept with it for a while. But do you know what I really wanted, Dad?" John's chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. "What, Jake?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I just wanted you to play with me," the boy said simply, his gaze lifting to meet John's. His eyes were filled with an innocence that made the words cut even deeper. "I wanted you to be there." "I'm sorry," John said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." Jake gave a small, sad smile. "You always said you'd come next time. But next time never came." John dropped to his knees in front of the boy, his hands trembling. "I was wrong, Jake. I see that now. I was so caught up in trying to be everything I thought I needed to be that I forgot to just be your dad. I'm so sorry." The boy studied him for a moment, then reached out and placed the soccer ball in John's hands. The moment his fingers touched it, the park began to dissolve, the edges of the scene crumbling into darkness. Jake's small voice echoed as the world around them faded. "Don't say sorry to me, Dad. Say it to the Jake who's still waiting." John blinked and the park was gone. He was back in the void, but this time, the emptiness didn't last. A new scene began to form around him, stark and cold. It was a courtroom, but not a memory, at least, not one John recognized. The room was cavernous, the air heavy with an oppressive silence. At the center stood a single figure, John himself. The younger version of John stood behind a podium, his posture stiff and defensive. Across from him sat a faceless crowd, their features blurred and indistinct, but their presence felt overwhelming, like a jury ready to deliver a damning verdict. "You're on trial," a voice boomed, echoing through the chamber. John turned to see the source but found nothing but shadows. "Your life, your choices, your regrets, they all lead to this moment. How do you plead?" John's younger self looked around, his face a mix of confusion and defiance. "I did the best I could," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "I provided for my family. I worked hard. Isn't that what I was supposed to do?" The crowd stirred, a low murmur rippling through them. The voice from the shadows spoke again. "And what did your family need most? Was it the money? The house? The things? Or was it you?" The younger John faltered, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I didn't know," he began, but the voice cut him off. "You didn't know because you didn't listen. You didn't see what was right in front of you." The scene shifted abruptly. John was now standing in the center of the courtroom, his younger self and the crowd gone. In their place was a single chair, and in that chair sat his grandfather. The older man's face was lined with sorrow, his eyes piercing as they met John's. "You've been given a gift, John," his grandfather said, his tone both gentle and stern. "A chance to see what you couldn't see before. But seeing is only the first step. The real question is, what will you do with it?" "I don't know," John admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." His grandfather leaned forward, his expression softening. "You don't have to fix the past, John. What's done is done. But you can choose what comes next. You can choose who you'll be when you wake up." John looked down at his hands, still clutching the soccer ball from the earlier scene. It felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of all his regrets. "What if it's too late?" he asked, his voice trembling. What if I've already lost them? It's never too late to try, his grandfather said. But trying takes courage. It takes humility. And it takes love. The void began to ripple again, and John felt the pull toward his body intensify. The beeping of hospital machines grew louder, breaking through the silence. His time here was running out, but he still didn't feel ready. There was more to see, more to understand. "Grandpa, please," he said, his voice desperate. "I need more time." His grandfather gave him a sad but knowing smile. "Time is what you make of it, John. Use it wisely." The light around him dimmed, and John felt himself being pulled back into the darkness once more. He was standing in the middle of his family's living room, but it wasn't the warm, inviting space he remembered. The air was thick with tension, and every detail seemed sharper, more unforgiving. Across the room, Jake, now a young teenager, was pacing back and forth, his face red with anger. Sarah sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly together, her expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. "You don't understand, Mom," Jake shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "He doesn't care about us. He never has." "Jake, that's not true," Sarah said softly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Your father loves you. Then why isn't he here?" Jake shot back, his eyes blazing. "Why is he always at work or too busy to even notice what's going on with us?" John felt his stomach drop. He recognized this argument. It had happened years ago, but at the time, he hadn't been there to witness it. He had been at the office, buried in a mountain of paperwork, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing at home. Seeing it now, as an observer, was like being punched in the gut. Jake turned and kicked the edge of the coffee table, causing Sarah to flinch. "You keep defending him, but he's never here when we need him," he yelled. "He wasn't there when I scored my first goal. He wasn't there when I had to present that stupid project at school. He's not even here now." "Jake, calm down," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. "Your dad is doing his best." "No, he's not," Jake interrupted, his voice rising. "He only cares about himself and his stupid job. I hate him." John staggered back as if the words had physically struck him. "Jake, no," he whispered, his throat tightening. "You don't mean that. I was trying to give you everything." The teenage Jake couldn't hear him, of course. He stormed out of the room, leaving Sarah alone, her head bowed. John wanted to go to her, to tell her he was sorry, but before he could move, the scene shifted again. This time, he was in Jake's bedroom. The boy was sitting on his bed, staring at his phone with a look of quiet devastation. His soccer cleats sat untouched in the corner, still covered in dirt from a game John had missed. Jake sighed heavily and put the phone down, then turned to a stack of papers on his desk. John moved closer, his chest tightening when he saw what they were: handwritten letters. Jake picked one up, staring at it for a long moment before ripping it in half and tossing it into a nearby trash bin. "What are you doing?" John asked, even though he knew Jake couldn't hear him. "What's in those letters?" The boy picked up another sheet of paper, but instead of tearing it, he folded it carefully and slid it into an envelope. On the front, in Jake's familiar scrawl, was written, "To Dad." John's heart ached as he watched his son place the envelope in a drawer and close it. The scene dissolved, leaving John in the void once more. He felt sick, his mind reeling from what he had seen. He turned around, desperate for answers, and was relieved to see his grandfather standing there, his face etched with quiet understanding. "Why didn't I see this before?" John asked, his voice shaking. "Why didn't anyone tell me how much I was hurting them?" "They did," his grandfather replied gently. "But you weren't listening. You heard what you wanted to hear, saw what you wanted to see." John shook his head, his fists clenching. "I was trying to provide for them. I thought I was doing the right thing. How could I have been so blind?" "It's easy to lose sight of what matters when you convince yourself you're doing it for the right reasons," his grandfather said. "But intentions aren't enough, John. Actions are what leave their mark." John felt a wave of guilt crash over him. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I've let them down so many times. How can I ever make it right?" "You can't change the past," his grandfather said. "But you can choose differently moving forward. The question is, will you?" Before John could respond, The void began to ripple again. This time, he was pulled into a scene that wasn't a memory but something more abstract. He was standing in a hallway lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. From behind them, faint voices and echoes drifted out, fragments of conversations and moments he couldn't quite place. He approached the nearest door and peeked inside. It was a vision of Sarah, years in the future. She was sitting in a small apartment, her hair streaked with gray. She looked older, more tired, but there was a quiet strength in her posture. On the table in front of her was a photo of their family, the edges worn and faded. "Do you think he ever knew?" she asked, her voice directed at someone out of view. "Knew what?" a voice replied. John recognized it as Jake's, deeper now, a man's voice. "That we forgave him," Sarah said quietly. "Even when he didn't deserve it." John's chest tightened. He wanted to call out to them, to tell them he had always loved them, that he had never meant to hurt them. But the scene faded before he could step through the door. The hallway stretched on endlessly, each door offering glimpses of futures he couldn't fully comprehend. Some were filled with joy, others with sorrow. Each one felt like a potential path, a choice waiting to be made. "You have more power than you think," his grandfather's voice echoed around him. "But that power lies in the present, John. What you choose now will shape everything that follows." The void rippled again, but this time, the shift was more gradual. A dim light grew in the distance, and John was drawn toward it, his steps hesitant but compelled by an unseen force. As the light grew brighter, the space around him began to take shape. It was a kitchen he recognized but hadn't stepped into in decades. The table was set for dinner, and the faint aroma of baked chicken and mashed potatoes filled the air. He could hear the sound of silverware clinking against plates and soft laughter, the kind of domestic harmony he hadn't experienced in years. At the table sat a younger version of himself, not much older than Jake was now. Across from him were his parents, their faces glowing with warmth. John froze in place. This wasn't just any kitchen, it was his childhood home. He hadn't thought of this place in ages, let alone the times he had spent there. His mother was bustling around the room, bringing dishes to the table, while his father sat at the head, a cup of coffee in hand. "Eat up, John," his father said with a chuckle. "You're going to need your strength for the big game tomorrow." Young John looked up from his plate, his face lighting up. "Are you coming, Dad?" he asked, his voice filled with eager anticipation. "Of course I am," his father replied, his tone steady and reassuring. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." John's chest tightened at the memory. He had clung to these moments as a child, the rare times his father had made a point to be present despite his demanding job. Those words, "wouldn't miss it for the world," had meant everything to him back then. "You've got this, John. Go for it." The memory hit John like a freight train. He hadn't thought about this game in years, but now, every detail came rushing back. The pride he had felt when his father was there, the way his dad had patted him on the back after the game and said he was proud. It was one of the few times he had felt truly seen. As he watched, the older John turned to see his grandfather standing nearby, his expression somber. "You remember how much this meant to you," his grandfather said, his voice quiet. "How it felt to have someone show up for you." John nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "So why did you forget how much it would mean to Jake?" The words cut deep, and John felt his shoulders slump. "I didn't forget," he said finally. I thought I was doing what I had to do. I didn't think." "No," his grandfather interrupted gently. "You didn't think. You convinced yourself that your presence didn't matter as much as your paycheck. But you knew better, John. You always knew better." The scene faded, and John was back in the void, the familiar heaviness settling over him. He looked at his grandfather, desperation etched into his face. "I don't know how to make it right," he said. "I've already missed so much. How can I go back and fix everything I've broken?" His grandfather's gaze softened. "You can't change what's already been done. But the future is still unwritten. You have the power to shape what comes next, John. The question is, will you?" "But I don't know what to say," the younger John said, his voice strained. "I know we didn't always see eye to eye, but..." The man on the bed stirred, his eyes opening slightly. "John," he said weakly, his voice barely audible. There's something I need to tell you." John leaned closer, his expression a mix of fear and hope. "What is it, Dad?" The older man's hand trembled as he reached out to grasp John's. "Don't make the same mistakes I did," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't wait until it's too late to tell the people you love how much they mean to you. Don't let work, or pride, or fear take that away from you." John's younger self nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I won't," he promised, his voice breaking. "I won't." The Real John watched, his chest tightening as the weight of his father's words settled over him. He had made that promise years ago, and yet he had failed to keep it. He had let the same patterns take hold, the same excuses and justifications that had driven a wedge between him and his own father. As the scene faded, John found himself back in the void once more, his grandfather standing before him. "You were given a chance to break the cycle," his grandfather said, his tone firm but not unkind. "And you chose not to. But now you have another chance, John. What will you do with it?" John swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," he admitted. "What if I fail again?" "Strength isn't about never failing," his grandfather replied. "It's about choosing to try again, even when it's hard. Even when you're scared." The pull toward his body grew stronger, and John could hear the faint beeping of hospital monitors in the distance. His time here was running out, but the lessons he had learned were etched into his soul. "I don't want to waste this chance," he said, his voice trembling. "But I don't know where to start." His grandfather gave him a small, encouraging smile. "You'll find your way, John. Trust yourself, and trust the people who love you." In the distance, he saw a figure walking toward him. The man's gait was steady, deliberate, and the closer he got, the more familiar he became. John's breath caught in his throat when he recognized the weathered face, the broad shoulders, and the calm authority in his step. "Grandpa?" John called out, though the words came out as a whisper. His grandfather nodded but didn't speak right away. Instead, he gestured for John to follow him. They walked in silence for a moment, the field stretching endlessly around them. John felt as though he should say something, but no words seemed adequate. He was overwhelmed by the weight of everything he'd seen, the memories, the regrets, the truths he had been forced to confront. Finally, his grandfather stopped and turned to face him. His eyes were filled with an intensity that John hadn't seen before, a mix of wisdom, compassion, and something else, urgency. "You've been shown the past, John," his grandfather began, his voice steady and firm. "You've seen your mistakes, your regrets. But what you do with that knowledge is what matters." "I understand that," John said, his voice cracking. "But I don't know where to start. I don't even know if I can fix this." "You're thinking of it as something to fix," his grandfather replied. "It's not about undoing what's been done. It's about choosing what you'll do next. It's about being present, about giving the people you love the one thing they've always needed most. I want to change," John said finally, his voice trembling with conviction. "I want to do better. But what if it's too late? What if I've already lost them?" His grandfather smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in his expression. "It's never too late to try, John. The people who love you, they'll see the effort. They'll feel it. But you have to mean it. You have to be willing to face the discomfort, the hard conversations, the moments where you have to humble yourself." John nodded slowly, his mind racing. "How do I start? How do I even begin to make things right?" His grandfather stepped closer, placing a hand on John's shoulder. "By showing up," he said simply. "Not with words or promises, but with action. Jake doesn't need grand gestures. He needs a father who's there for him, who listens, who plays soccer with him in the yard, who tells him he's proud." John felt his throat tighten as tears welled up in his eyes. "I want to be that for him," he said. "I want to be the dad he deserves." "And Sarah?" his grandfather prompted. "She's carried the weight of your absence for years, John. She's tried to hold it all together, but she needs a partner, not just someone who shares a house with her. She needs to feel seen, valued, loved." The mention of Sarah hit him hard. He had taken her strength for granted, assuming she would always be there, always understanding, always forgiving. He realized now how much he had asked of her, how much she had sacrificed for their family while he had buried himself in work. "I've failed them both," John admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "But I don't want to fail them anymore." "Then don't," his grandfather said simply. "It's as simple and as hard as that. The path forward isn't easy, John, but it's worth it. And it starts with you choosing to take that first step." The golden field around them began to fade, the light growing dimmer. John felt the pull toward his body intensify, the faint beeping of hospital monitors becoming louder and more insistent. He looked at his grandfather, panic flashing across his face. "Wait," he said. "I'm not ready yet. I still need to." "You are ready," his grandfather interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "You've always had the strength to do this, John. You just needed to see it." The field dissolved entirely, leaving John in the void once more. The pull toward his body was undeniable now, a force he couldn't resist even if he wanted to. His grandfather's voice echoed around him, the final words resonating deeply in his soul. "Remember, John, time is precious. Don't waste it." The beeping of the monitors grew louder, and John felt a rush of sensation as he was yanked back toward the hospital room. The void disappeared completely, and for the first time since this journey began, John felt the weight of his body again. His eyes fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital coming into focus. The faces of nurses and doctors swam before him, their voices muffled but growing clearer with each passing moment. "Welcome back," one of them said, relief evident in their tone. John's heart was pounding, his mind racing with everything he had seen, everything he had learned. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had been given another chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. John lay in the hospital bed, the world around him slowly coming back into focus. The stark whiteness of the room, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, and the faint murmur of voices outside his door grounded him in reality. Yet, his mind was still in the ethereal space he had just left, replaying every word his grandfather had said and every memory he had confronted. His body ached, and each breath felt like a struggle, but he couldn't focus on the pain. Instead, he turned his head slightly, scanning the room. The first face he saw was Sarah's. She was sitting in a chair near the bed, her hands clasped tightly together as though she had been praying. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Despite everything, she looked up at him with a mixture of relief and worry. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice breaking. John tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and his voice came out as little more than a rasp. He swallowed hard and tried again. "Sarah?" She leaned forward, taking his hand in hers. "Don't try to talk too much," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've been through a lot. The doctors said you're lucky to be alive." But the word hit him like a hammer. He wasn't just lucky, he had been given a gift, a second chance to make things right. He tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes locking onto hers. "But I'm sorry," he managed to say, his voice raw with emotion. Sarah's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "For what?" "For everything," he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "For all the times I wasn't there, for every promise I broke, for every moment I let you carry the weight alone." Her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to respond, but John pushed on, his voice gaining strength despite the tears welling up in his eyes. "I've been blind, Sarah. I thought I was doing what was best for you and Jake, but I wasn't. I was running away from the things that mattered most. I was running away from you." Sarah's lips trembled and she looked away, blinking back tears. "John, you don't have to do this right now. You've just been through—" "I need to do this," he interrupted, his voice firm. "Because I've wasted so much time already, and I can't waste another second." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Sarah looked back at him, her expression softening. "You scared me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was going to lose you." "I scared myself," John admitted. "But Sarah, I saw things. I can't explain it, but I saw everything I've done wrong. I saw what I've been missing. And I don't want to be that man anymore. I want to be better. For you, for Jake, for all of us." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, and she squeezed his hand tightly. "We've been waiting for you to see that, John." "I've been waiting." Her words hit him like a jolt, and he felt a fresh wave of determination surge through him. "I see it now," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion thickening his throat. "And I promise, I'm not going to let you down again." The door to the room opened suddenly, breaking the moment. John turned his head to see Jake standing hesitantly in the doorway. He looked older than John remembered, his face etched with worry that seemed far too heavy for someone his age. His eyes darted between his parents, uncertainty and fear evident in his expression. "Hey, buddy," John said, his voice soft but warm. Jake didn't respond right away. He lingered in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders hunched. Finally, he took a tentative step forward. "Mom said you almost—" "I know," John said gently, cutting him off. "But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." Jake's eyes welled up, and he looked down, his hands fidgeting nervously. "You always say that," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. The words stung, but John didn't flinch. Instead, he reached out a hand, beckoning Jake closer. "You're right," he said. "I've said that before, and I didn't follow through. But I'm not just saying it this time, Jake. I mean it. And I'm going to show you." Jake hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, his movements tentative. When he reached the bed, John placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "I've missed too many of your games, too many of your milestones," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to miss anything else. I want to be there for you, from now on." Jake looked up at him, his expression a mix of hope and lingering doubt. "Do you mean it, Dad?" "I do," John said firmly. "And I'm going to prove it to you. Every single day." Jake studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Then, to John's surprise, the boy leaned forward and wrapped his arms around him, hugging him tightly. John closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face as he hugged his son back, his heart swelling with gratitude and determination. "I love you, Jake," he said, his voice breaking. "More than anything." "I love you too, Dad," Jake whispered, his voice muffled against John's shoulder. The moment stretched on, filling the room with a warmth John hadn't felt in years. When Jake finally pulled away, Sarah was smiling through her tears, her hands still resting on John's. For the first time in what felt like forever, John felt hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. As he lay back against the pillows, the weight of everything he had seen and learned settled over him. He still had a long road ahead, and it wouldn't be easy. But he was ready to face it, one step at a time, with the people he loved by his side.